Hi, I'm Claire Mitchell, QC. Welcome to the Witches of Scotland podcast. I'm a lawyer who specialises in miscarriage of justice cases, and we're bringing you this podcast because we want to tell you about the women who were accused, prosecuted, convicted, and ultimately executed as witches in Scotland.
I'm Zoe Venditozzi, and I'm a writer who's always had an interest in the witches, and I feel that this dark mark against Scotland needs a reckoning.
The campaign Witches of Scotland wants three things. Firstly, a pardon for all those convicted of witchcraft. Secondly, an apology for all those who were accused as witches. And finally, a national monument in recognition of all those who are affected by this terrible miscarriage of justice.
Over the forthcoming weeks, we'll be talking to a whole host of experts about the history and the modern day connections to the Witches of Scotland. Welcome to episode 4, especially to all our new listeners. Please do keep sharing the podcast so we can reach as many people as possible. We'd especially like to say hello to all our listeners in America and Australia, of which we have quite a few. So please do spread the word, because the more people that know about the campaign, the higher likelihood we have of success. If this is your first time listening to the podcast, please do go back and check out the other episodes that are all available.
Today we're going to talk to Professor Julian Goodare. He's Professor of History at the University of Edinburgh, and what he doesn't know about witches isn't worth knowing. He's edited or co-edited a number of books, including Scottish Witches and Witch Hunters, Witchcraft and Belief in Early Modern Scotland, and the Scottish Witch Hunt in Context. He's also written a book, The European Witch Hunt, which he refers to in our discussions. He is director of the Survey of Scottish Witchcraft, along with his co-director, Louise Yeoman. And I know a number of you have had a good look at that, because it really is the most interesting and up-to-date survey that we have about all the women that were killed as witches in Scotland.
We started off asking Julian about alewives and spaewives.
I occasionally come across the word spaewife, which you will very occasionally see in the documents that I look at. It became more common in discourse about witches in, I think, 19th and 20th century, and it's linked to the idea that witches were somehow practitioners of something. And spaewife means prophetic woman. And because it's a sort of vernacular Scottish word, it sounds good.
Do you think it's got something to do with like the word seer?
Seers, that's another of the kind of thing that people today are thinking that early modern witches were. Particularly the modern magical practitioners, Wiccans, neo-pagan community, like the idea that there were people like them in the past, and they like the idea that the people like them in the past were persecuted as witches. And there used to be an idea that the witches of the past were in fact practicing pagans. And this is an idea that has muddied the waters of scholarship for many decades in the 20th century. And, it's almost entirely wrong.
When we first started this, my feeling was very much received wisdom. It was pretty much all women. They were pagans. And it's really interesting as we're doing this to discover actually there are much more mundane or banal reasons. So there weren't really pagans then.
A pagan is somebody who worships pagan gods, in contrast with a Christian who worships the Christian God. I mean, it's one of the doctrines of Christianity is that there only is one God, though we can then start talking about a trinity. But most pagan religions have worshipped a pantheon of a number of gods. And in a European context, we tend to be talking either about Celtic paganism or Roman paganism or Germanic paganism. And, those are three groups of religions which existed before Christianity. The idea in the mid-20th century was mainly launched by a book published in 1921 called The Witch Cult in Western Europe by Margaret Murray. She contended that there had been a surviving pagan cult which had continued since pre-Christian times. The Christians in the early centuries AD had never really got down to the level of the common people. And, it was just a religion of the elite. The common people remained pagan. And in early modern times, there were still a few actually practicing pagans who did, as I put it, get up in the morning and think, I'm a pagan. They might not have used that word for it, but they worshipped the old gods. And Murray used the confessions of early modern witches in a highly selective and, in fact, fraudulent way to suggest that they were worshippers of these old gods. And she argued that they operated in covens. And, if you think that witches operated in covens, then you're hearing a distant echo of the works of Margaret Murray. They were in groups of 13. And so they worshipped a horned god. And she supported this with carefully selected quotations from early modern sources. But it really will not stand up for anyone who looks at these sources in a scholarly or objective way. And it was frequently criticized for many decades and really terminally exploded in 1975 in a chapter of a book called Europe's Inner Demons by Norman Cohn. It then sort of survived among the neo-pagan community because the neo-pagan community grew up initially in England in the middle years of the 20th century, which was very much when Murray was writing. And the earliest Wiccans, as they tend to call themselves, were actually in touch with Murray and her ideas, and they reconstructed in their mind this surviving pre-Christian pagan religion, and some of the practitioners convinced themselves that they were inheritors of this tradition. Now, just how exactly Gerald Gardner, who was the leading person who's always mentioned, convinced himself that he was a member of a coven of witches that had survived since pre-Christian times. This has been written about at some length by my friend Ronald Hutton in his book, The Triumph of the Moon, History of Modern Pagan Witchcraft. He did, in all sincerity, convince himself of this. It did require a certain amount of imagination and reconstruction. But he published a book called Witchcraft Today in 1954, in which he announced that he was a member of a coven that had survived since pre-Christian times. And Margaret Murray, the scholar who had launched the idea, contributed a foreword to the book. So the idea caught on among these early pagans that they were the inheritors of a tradition and that they had been persecuted in the 16th and 17th centuries by the Christians. This idea, as I say, has been largely debunked by historians. And I don't really want to tread on anyone's religious faith. If a pagan today tells me that they find it meaningful to regard themselves as inheritors of an ancient tradition and that their forebears were burnt as witches, I will merely say carefully that as a professional historian, I can say only that the documentary historical evidence does not support that view. But of course, people have many other sources of ideas and evidence.
Was she deliberately playing fast and loose with facts, or is there any evidence about what her sort of agenda was?
She was certainly pushing a particular line much further than an impartial scholar would support. I have not read her third and last book, The Divine King in England, but I sort of leafed through it, and my understanding is that its idea is that there was a pagan cult at the top levels of English history. The king and his supporters were not Christians. They pretended to be, but they actually had an idea about divine kingship, which Murray had picked up from Sir James Fraser, the 19th century anthropologist, the idea that the king needed to be sacrificed for fertility. And so she rewrote English history and explained that whenever an English king died prematurely, this pagan cult sacrificing the king for fertility and putting out a story that there was some political reason for the death of William Rufus or Edward II or whatever. I think even Charles I, the execution of Charles I, was attributed to this pagan cult and pretending to have his head cut off, but really it was that actually this pagan cult. I can't quite get into the mind of someone who produces stuff like this, so I don't really want to impute motives.
I'm really shocked our modern idea of witches is a construct from the 20s.
Only part of it. The cauldron, the pointy hat, the broomstick, and the cat all come from other sources.
Is there any general source from which we define a witch in the way that we sort of do in the modern day? If you were to say, I'm going to dress up as a witch for Halloween, and you imagine the look, the cats, the cauldron, the hats, the wearing black, where did that come from?
Well, the dress mostly comes from hostile or mocking depictions of witches in the 18th century in England. And this was when political cartoonists would attribute belief in witches to their enemies. These people are so silly as to believe in witches. Witches were seen as old-fashioned. Modern enlightened people in the 18th century no longer believe in witchcraft. It's a silly thing. It's a thing for old women to believe in. And those clothes were old-fashioned clothes at that time. The pointed hat was an old-fashioned thing, and so the pointed hat is an out-of-date item of dress that we today no longer find fashionable.
Previous to these political cartoons, then, that wasn't sort of the cultural mental picture of a witch then. So it was only when these cartoons came in the 18th century that there started to be the connotation was the pointy hat. So before that...
The pointy hat comes from that, yes. Before that, witches would be depicted wearing ordinary clothes or occasionally no clothes at all. It's all a construct from a number of different sources. I mean, the broomstick is mainly French, I think. And there is actually a 15th century French manuscript from the 1440s, I think, which has a marginal illustration of two witches, one flying on a plain stick and another flying on a broomstick. I'm told you can now get this on a T-shirt. That's the oldest depiction of a witch on a broomstick. And actually, throughout the centuries of witch hunting, when witches were depicted flying, they're depicted flying in various ways, using various vehicles or occasionally no vehicles at all. Sometimes they're flying on demons, sometimes they're flying on demonic dragons, often on goats, actually. Another very common thing was a forked cooking stick, particularly in Germany, I think, had a long stick with a fork on the end to put a pot in and out of the oven or hold a pot over a fire. And the forked cooking stick came to be a sort of witch's accessory in Germany. And there are many images of witches flying on forked cooking sticks or simply brandishing this forked cooking stick. It's a long thing, about as long as a broomstick, but instead of a broom on the end, there's simply a sort of U-shaped stick. Why it is that the broomstick survived and not the forked cooking stick, offhand, I don't know, but presumably there's an illustrator's tradition sometime in the 18th or 19th century plugged into the broomstick and not the forked cooking stick. So the broomstick, mainly French. The cat is mainly English because English witches were sometimes said to have demonic familiars, which were small animals, sometimes cats. Often they were toads. For some reason, we find it harder to imagine a witch with a pet toad. But because modern society recognizes pet cats as things, the idea that witches had pet cats has survived. And so we depict witches with cats.
Our idea of a witch could be very, very different. It could be a lady with effectively a fork and a toad.
Yeah, or it could be an owl. I've actually got a fridge magnet that someone gave me from Germany showing witches flying on broomsticks carrying owls. So the modern image is a composite of many different ideas, and witchcraft itself is a composite of different ideas. You can't sort of trace witchcraft back to a single thing and then you've got the ultimate witchcraft. It's not like that. It's always spreading out in different directions, pulling things into itself.
Can I ask, when the witch hunt was at its peak and there were so many people being accused and executed, did people broadly genuinely believe that these women and some men were actually doing witchcraft? Because I'm still a bit perplexed by this.
Oh, yes, this is a very common modern myth. They don't really believe in it, but if you want to get rid of someone, you accuse them of witchcraft. But it is perplexing because if you think about it, if nobody believes in witchcraft, how much weight does a witchcraft accusation carry? Mm-hmm. It only works if people believe in it. So why not just go all the way and say, yes, actually, yeah, they did believe in it. The accusers believed in it. The accused believed in it. The authorities believed in it. And if you accused somebody of witchcraft, it wasn't because you want their land or dislike them for some other reason. It's because you think they're a witch.
That's fascinating. What I want to ask really is, how many people did this affect in Scotland? We know numbers can never be exact because you're looking at documents and trying to trace it out. But if you can explain to us how you've tried to work out what the numbers are and what you think the numbers are.
Okay, well, the numbers in Scotland are higher than the European average. And the European average contains, very wide variations. So Scotland is not the top of the league. When you compare different countries or regions, you are not necessarily comparing like with like. In general, the most intense place for witch hunting is Germany, and particularly Western Germany and the Rhineland area. It's very hard to draw a line around a particular area. You can draw lines around larger areas and they will have lower numbers. And you can carefully select a very small area. You can produce, huge numbers. And Scotland is the size that it is. But, even Scotland is a sort of artificial thing. Scotland contains regions with very low numbers and regions with much higher numbers. I mean, if you drew a line around East Lothian, the numbers per head would be much higher because that's the top county. If I just pursue this average business for a bit longer, the figure that I like to quote for Scotland is that Scotland's execution rate per head is about 5 times the European average of executions per head of population. But if you take a much smaller place, you can get much higher than 5. And my friend Lieve Willumsen is a Norwegian scholar, and she worked out the figures for Scotland. And so you'd really have to ask her how she did it. I can more or less tell you how she came up with the figure of 2,500, which gives me the basis for saying it's 5 times the European average, because the European average would predict about 500 executions for Scotland. But Lieve Willumsen also works on northern Norway, which is Finnmark is Norway's most northerly county, and they had panics in Finnmark. Now, the numbers are very small, and they have only, depending on how you count them, 88 or 91 executions, but in a tiny population. If you run the numbers per head of population, Finnmark has got 60 times the European average.
Was that the place, Julian, that has the memorial to the witches?
Yes, those 91 have all got individual plaques telling their little story that Lieve Willumsen wrote.
And that's something I think we'll maybe ask you and come on to talk about a little later. But you reckon then in Scotland that there would be about 2,500 executions. Do you know how many allegations there would have been?
We can suggest that there may have been about 4,000 cases that went as far as an allegation recorded in a legal context. I mean, it depends what you mean by an allegation. If one person calls another person a witch, is that an allegation? Perhaps it is. If one person calls another person a witch in the presence of an official who writes it down, that's more important. So those 4,000 won't necessarily all be trials. That 4,000 is probably a conservative estimate. There are probably somewhat more than that. And I should perhaps explain that the number of executions is particularly obscure for Scotland because the documentary records that we have don't usually tell us definitively about execution or not. You've looked at the Survey of Scottish Witchcraft. The great majority of the individual cases that we have, we can't say what happened to them. That's because the record that we most commonly have, the reason that we know the names of these people is that the record that we've got is a commission of justiciary, which is an order to hold a trial. So we know that a trial was ordered. You can guess that the trial probably was held after it was ordered, though perhaps it wasn't. And you have to ask yourself what the result of that trial would have been. And what Lieve Willumsen did in order to come up with the figure of 2,500 was to disaggregate different types of trials and to try and work out from the surviving cases where we do know the result, how likely it was for that kind of trial to produce an execution priority.
Oh, well,
it's convinced me.
Yeah, I would definitely like to see that paper if and when it came out. In fact, I don't want to read it. What I want to do is you to read it, Julian, and then explain to me what it means.
Yeah, well, I've done that to the best of my ability. We can talk about it for longer, but you've probably got other questions.
Oh, yes.
And in fact, I think you already have other questions. Can I just unpack, however, the 2,500 number a bit further? And, what does 2,500 mean? The population of Scotland in the time we're talking about is about 1 million. And
I didn't realise that the population was in fact so small at that time. Yeah. That paints an even bigger picture of how many people were involved.
Yeah. It is not really large numbers. Now, in my European book, I ran the numbers for the whole of Europe, and I looked at the period of time for which witchcraft executions occurred. And I thought to myself, how could I relate that to death rates for things today? And I have some statistics for death rates for modern Britain.
Wow.
I don't have them for the whole of Europe, but they're probably not that different in different European countries. And if I can put it this way, the risk, if you lived in early modern Europe, the risk of being executed for witchcraft, and that being your cause of death, was not very large. And it was similar to the risk today for death by air accident.
That
Yeah.
paints quite a different picture, because I think as well we've got this idea that
Yeah.
there was this huge mass hysteria, and that all, many women would be living in fear, at peak times of it. The finger could be pointed at them.
Mhm.
That's very surprising as well.
Although I would say, I can imagine in a small community, if you heard one of your neighbours had been arrested for being a witch, then that would be very, very real in that community for that period of time.
And saying before about there's areas where there was bigger clusters. I suppose if you lived in an area where there had been obviously more, you would be more nervous or worried about it.
Oh yeah, definitely. And in Scotland, I haven't run those same numbers for Scotland, but the period of witch hunting is shorter, which maybe that's a good thing, I don't know. But the period of witch hunting is shorter, and the numbers are higher, and proportions of the population. So it would be several times.
Because it's over a shorter period of time, it would be much more concentrated.
Well, it's mainly that we've already got 5 times the average.
Yes.
So you've got to multiply that by 5. If you then halve the time period, which you probably would for Scotland, because I was taking the longest time periods for Europe as a whole, so you then get 10 times during that period. And if you then take the more intense panic periods, you're probably multiplying it by at least another 10, if not another 100. Another figure that I offered in my European book is, how many people does it take to execute someone, in the sense of how many people are involved in the trial, how many personnel of the court, how many people does it take to actually build a pyre and burn someone at the stake, and how many witnesses and so forth will there be, how many people involved in the criminal justice system. And I came up with the figure of maybe about 100 overall. So 100 people who know that they were involved in some way in the execution of the witch. This is something that very, very much does touch people's consciousness.
On those numbers, as you say, you would either know someone that was involved in it as a witch, or know someone that was involved perhaps in the process of judging a witch, building the pyre. The real question is, what was it that started the witchcraft panic, the 4 or 5 periods where the witchcraft trials were whipped up? What was it about Scotland that started that? So, Zoe, we've ended in a bit of a cliffhanger there. When is our next podcast going to drop?
It will be out next Sunday, as we seem to have gotten into a pattern with this now. So they come out on Sundays, which is good because you can have a day of contemplation and reflection where you can find out about some terrible things that happened in the past. Make sure you do better on Monday than your ancestors did hundreds of years ago.
If you'd like to learn more about the Witches of Scotland, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Sign up for our mailing list at www.witchesofscotland.com to keep updated with the campaign. On that site, you'll be able to find how to link with us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.